Hello and welcome to World Insight. The program is focusing on Davos Agenda today. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with Davos Agenda 2021. More than 2,000 businesses, government, and international organizations, civil society leaders are meeting virtually this time for the World Economic Forum Davos Agenda. This week, under the theme, A Crucial Year to Rebuild Trust. The forum will discuss current challenges such as COVID-19 vaccine distribution, job creation, climate change, and global cooperation. Chinese President Xi Jinping attended the virtual meeting and delivered a keynote speech on Monday, saying the world has encountered several crises in the past year and stressed the need for global action response and cooperation.
现在，疫情还远未结束。
The recent resurgence in COVID cases reminds us that we must carry on the fight. Yet we remain convinced that winter cannot stop the arrival of spring and darkness can never shroud the light of dawn. There is no doubt that humanity will prevail over the virus and emerge even stronger from this disaster.
在同灾难的斗争中，成长进步。
I believe this is the best time to reset our policies and to work jointly for a peaceful and prosperous world.
And for more on the latest about Davos Agenda, we are joined in Brussels by Daniel Groh, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. via Skype, Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Last but not least in Beijing, Chu Qiang, Assistant Director from International Monetary Institute at Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Davos Agenda taking place virtually, unlike earlier years. In face-to-face, physically in the snow town of Davos. But the agenda is becoming ever more important. Let me ask brief response from every one of you. When it comes to reset the agenda, you already heard quotes from Chinese president. What kind of agenda we should really reset now? Mr. Schott from Washington.
Well, thank you, and thank you again for inviting me back.
Good to see you,
I think
sir.
that the overall theme of the World Economic Conference was crucial year to rebuild trust. And that's crucial, crucial for the United States and China to work together even when we have differences in some areas. And so rebuilding trust, which has been greatly eroded over the past 4 years, is a first order priority. And doing so in the area of dealing with the pandemic is urgent.
Rebuilding trust, particularly China and the U.S. Mr. Gross, your take. What should be reset?
I agree that building or rebuilding trust is really paramount. We are all grappling with deep-seated problems, perhaps more so in Europe than the United States and China. And if we want to deal with these problems together, we can do it only if we have a common understanding and trust in each other.
Mr. Chu from Beijing, your thoughts? Rebuilding trust and reset the agenda.
Yes, I do think that's very important because I think we need to build the trust in two different levels. One, like all our co-workers has mentioned, the trust between China and America among different nations all over the world. That's a must for sure if we want to win this battle. And also there's another trust we need to rebuild. That is the trust among our societies, internal societies. We need to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah.
People from different sectors, different levels of the society, everybody need to understand what is our real challenge and a common problem it is right now. That's the pandemic. And everybody need to know how to fight against this pandemic.
Okay.
Everybody have to know how to deal with it. And then we can win this battle.
Consensus, that's very important. After consensus, there needs to be real action, and that's when cooperation comes in. In his speech, Chinese President Xi, who delivered a speech just a few hours ago, talked about cooperation between countries that are different from one another. Take a listen as his perspective.
世界上没有两片完全相同的树叶。
No two leaves in the world are identical, and no histories, cultures, or social systems are the same. To build small circles or start a new Cold War, to reject, threaten, or intimidate others, to willfully impose decoupling, supply disruption, or sanctions, and to create isolation or estrangement will only push the world into division and even confrontation. We cannot tackle common challenges in a divided world, and confrontation will lead us to a dead end. The right approach is to act on the vision of a community with a shared future for mankind.
我们要秉持人类命运共同体理念。
That's a quote coming from Chinese President Xi Jinping during his speech at the Davos Agenda, the first leader to deliver a speech there. Having said that, though, Mr. Shah, lack of cooperation has been the biggest challenge over the year 2020, which certainly has been exacerbated by pandemic, economic problems, and many other internal issues within many national borders. Now, can we start to cooperate? What does it take? Will geopolitics allow that? Your take?
I think in two critical areas, there's going to be more cooperation, just because the United States is resuming its leadership role in the world community in the area of dealing with the pandemic and in climate change. The first things that President Biden did when he entered the White House on January 20th was sign orders restoring U.S. leadership in these two vital areas. So that's very helpful. And I think countries need to understand that we've created problems over the last 4 years, but it's time to stop digging the hole deeper and start finding a way out of the holes that we've been led into over the past 4 years.
Mm. Coming from the European perspective, Mr. Schott, we have seen the U.S. Somewhat coming back to its original promises after some time of absence. Whether it's a leadership position or not, probably only time could tell. Mr. Gross, though, at this point, it's not necessarily the point to talk about leadership, but rather to talk about how can we proceed from here? What's the next? How can we do things together? Mr. Gross, do you think the EU has an idea already?
I think many in Europe have an idea. They're looking forward to a new area where there's a joint leadership, perhaps, between Europe and the United States in the two areas that were mentioned before, namely climate change and the fight against COVID and the distribution of vaccines around the world. These are two areas where I think America and the EU can cooperate, and I think they will.
What about China, Europe? Earlier at the end of last year have been coming together to draw upon a plan about bilateral investment, and that seems to be making a lot of steam. Now, of course, it needs to be approved by various organizations before it comes to reality. At a time when trade is becoming so vulnerable, what do we need to do? How important it is that we hold on to these possibilities, Mr. Gross, if I could?
This recent agreement between China and the European Union is on investment. So it's not directly on trade, but it's an important part of the relations between Europe and China. The agreement itself is not so important because the details which have been published show that both sides have basically stuck to their own positions, but both sides promise each other a lot. And therefore, I think the most important part of this agreement will be its implementation in the future. If it is ratified this year, that's not the end of the story. It needs to be lived, it needs to be implemented. And therefore, we'll discover only over the next few years whether these are words, diplomatic signals, or actual actions which will follow on the ground.
So many things are only at its starting point, not necessarily at all reaching a conclusion yet, including many of the areas that the international community might be talking about this week during the Davos Agenda. Mr. Chu, Professor, tell me more about, from China's perspective, how do you see things will proceed? The latest news suggests China has already surpassed the United States, become the favorite destination for foreign investment. Having said that, though, Mr. Xu, it's also well known that China has a traditional saying suggesting one flower does not make a spring. Only when you have all flower blossom, that makes a big day. So having said that, though, how will China work with others, hopefully on the international economic and trade governance, and also, certainly, the big word, cooperation?
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned that China has right now become very popular for the international investment. But I would like to be very, very reasonable about the current situation, because capital sometimes they're pursuing the profit. Right now, China is handling the pandemic pretty well. So we have all the reasons to see the international investment to flow into China to seek for a safe haven. But let's be realistic. Well, the international investment will go back and forth between China and the U.S., China and the EU, China and other emerging markets. That's just a very normal situation. They wouldn't stay here for forever. So what my point is, if we want everybody to get on the win-win result, we need to cooperate. Multilateralism is very important because we need to create a favorable condition and environment for all the investment, for all the production activities. So it needs China and US, China and EU, US and EU, and all the emerging markets and the G20 countries to work together. And that's what you mentioned about every flower need to blossom, and then we'll see a beautiful picture of economic growth. And that is not a choice, that is the must.
Mr. Shah, that is the biggest concern, isn't it? Mr. Xi, the Chinese president, also mentioned in his speech, without letting you to interpret his speech, that may not be fair, but rather tell us more about how much is there that countries and economies will be able to work together. A new administration inside your country, how much energy does it have to deal with the impeachment and the early stage of fighting the pandemic and be able to come back to the international stage while talking about cooperation?
Well, the United States can do both, but the first priority is to get our own house in order.
Yeah.
And that is what President Biden and his team, which aren't yet fully in place because they have to be approved by the Senate, I think that's the first order. And to get the stimulus, to have the funds to deal with the pandemic, to allow the economy to open, to subsidize the states so that they can keep schools and jobs open. That's the first priority. And having an open the United States will be a benefit for the rest of the world community. At the same time, the U.S. will be more constructively engaged in international organizations. But I think multilateral initiatives will take some time. And indeed, the major countries have to get out of the mindset that they've been in for decades, that the way to reach multilateral agreement is for the other guy to change his policy and to adopt the standards of one country. I think climate change sets the example that everyone has to adapt for the global good and change their policies and do a much more difficult job in changing policies to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions.
Mr. Gross, now the same question to you about that. We have seen a lot of momentums on so many different fronts, but the world has to prioritize what can be the lower hanging fruit that would give us courage and probably a fruit to celebrate about as a result of cooperation, Mr. Gross.
Of course, the first step has already been taken by the US to rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change.
Yes.
Another step would be for the major powers to get together and agree on a reform of the World Trade Organization, its appellate body, so that judgments of the WTO can again be implemented. That is one of those long-hanging fruits, technical, but very important for trade and for the confidence in every country in the world that trade can continue under predictable rules.
Mr. Xi, in his speech, Mr. President of China also mentioned about that, what's going to be China's role in terms of contributing to trade, global trade, and the global supply chain. Your take about the latest response from the Chinese side?
Well, I think the Chinese response has been very, very clear. It mentioned about what we're going to do in the future, multilateralism and open platform. China is going to make its contribution to the world by using its productivities and technologies. And I think the direction is quite clear. And China is making a very, very clear commitment to everyone. China is not going to close up again because China is already deep incorporated into the international value chain, and China is making its contribution to the world. So I don't think China is going to just quit and carry out any discriminations or isolation policies towards the rest of the world. China will be a very steady player and a steady contributor to the world trade system as usual.
Are you worried, Mr. Chu, though, that others might be playing the so-called exclusive game toward China, which might be some suspect about that here in China, and there will also hear some air from some other parts of the world, suggested by certain extreme voices. Do you think China is worried about that?
Well, I think China has already paid attention to that kind of situation. I think it's frank to say, we should be frank to say that China has a certain concerns because in this uncertain situation, especially when pandemics coming up here and also when the global economy is going on to a downturn, so a certain country probably will try to divert their attention to the other countries, the country who is in a steady situation, who is still keep on growing. That's a very normal situation that kept going on for thousands of years in human history. But that would be just a temporary situation. In the long run, human beings will cooperate with each other.
Wow, that's very philosophical to me, but I think short term needs to be done well before we talk about the long term. In response to President Xi Jinping's speech regarding pandemic, earlier I talked exclusively to Hilda Schwab, chairperson and co-founder of Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurs from the World Economic Forum. She mentioned how the pandemic changed our lives. Take a listen.
This crisis, I think, finally made us also aware that our satisfaction does not come just from material success, but from our well-being.
Yes,
including social and cultural dimension, of course. I have been talking about hope, but I feel right now we are a little bit stuck. Yes. Where we are, and we don't move forward in this fight.
Mrs. Schwab talking about the situation of the world that she feels as someone who's been actively participating in the World Economic Forum. Having heard her quote coming from the other two gentlemen, I would like to hear Mr. Gross. Europe still battling against the pandemic. Now, the winter is very difficult. Vaccine a must, but slowly rolling out. So on the global fight against the pandemic, would that be a provision of confidence for all of us? Or it really depends on every country's own strengths, as we have seen about the accessibility and affordability of the vaccine so far?
So far, European politicians have been willing to play a global game. They have, of course, secured the minimum for their own population, but they're participating in the global forum to distribute vaccines.
COVAX.
But ultimately, politicians will only be able to COVAX, yes, and politicians will only be able to participate fully in these global initiatives and take the interests of humanity into account when they feel that they're strong at home, that people are following them at home. And that's the major danger I see in Europe. The populations are getting impatient. Why are we still locked at home? Why are things not going more quickly? And I think we have to get our house in order really very quickly in Europe, and then I'm certain that Europe can contribute to global problems.
Mr. Shaw, in the U.S., also a very tragic picture. So the Biden administration, $1.9 trillion, you earlier mentioned, a lot of it has to do with 100 million doses of vaccines into the arms of the Americans, but that is the promise. So how well will they be able to deliver, but at the same time, as you said, perform on the global stage to contribute, for example, about vaccine? That is an interesting balance. Words, can it match the deeds?
Well, we have a very difficult situation. The vaccine was developed in record time. That was a monumental achievement. The planning for the distribution of the vaccine, which is equally important, was a dismal failure. And now the problem is too much time has passed. The COVID virus we already see various variants that are more virulent and transmit much more quickly. And that is leading countries to close up borders. They have to prevent a second wave, a third wave, a fourth wave. And so the first order of business has to be to accelerate the injection of the vaccines, the development of variants of the vaccines to address the new variants of the virus, and to boost up production, not just in the United States and Europe, but so that supplies of the incoming vaccines that will soon be available will be available for the developing world. Because as we see now, the problems are being created in Brazil and South Africa, and those are transmitting to Europe and the United States. And if we don't deal with those countries and help them, we're going to have their problems in our backyard.
Accessibility and affordability, that's what Chinese president emphasized in his speech, Mr. Xi, about the vaccines, for example. Now, particularly for the global south, this has become an increasingly difficult question. Your take?
Well, my take is the international cooperation right now really are facing a very important moment. So I think every party, every country, and every organization, we need really to put out our full strength and full sincerity. Because if we win this battle, we're going to have a brighter future working as a whole, as a human being. But if we failed, I think the loss will be bigger than what we're facing right now. It's more than just economy. It's more than just a political instability. It's more than that. It's going to cost the mutual trust of all human beings.
Well, I think probably the short term, there needs to be some specific actions taken. And what those actions should be, besides COVAX, the leaders of the world and also the business leaders and stakeholders really have to come together and decide. The last point is about climate change. I want to leave all of you with this quote coming from the Chinese president and also from the president of the World Economic Forum about climate change. Take a look. In President Xi Jinping's address, he talked about China's commitment to doing its part to tackle climate change challenges. Take a listen.
中国力争于2030年前二氧化碳排放达到峰值。
I have announced China's goal of striving to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. Meeting these targets will require tremendous hard work from China. Yet we believe that when the interests of the entire humanity are at stake, China must step forward, take action, and get the job done.
These are words coming from the Chinese side. I'm sure leaders from other economies are also thinking about their ways and also possibly and hopefully the way of cooperation and building bridges through the issue of climate change, as it is indeed a global challenge facing all of us. Earlier, I talked exclusively to Borge Brende, who's the president of the World Economic Forum. He hopes the Biden administration will be receptive to the solutions suggested by the Chinese side to cooperate. Take a listen.
So I do hope that in the year to come, that President Xi Jinping and also President Joe Biden will find a good way to work together, because we know if we're going to address the three C's, COVID, climate change, and cooperation, we need the world to come together. And COVID anywhere is COVID everywhere, and climate change doesn't know any kind of borders. So we are all in the same boat. And this is also what President Xi Jinping alluded to in Davos in 2017. We do need to work together and also to strengthen the multilateral cooperation.
Brooke Benda, the president of the World Economic Forum. With that quote, I would like to wrap up today's discussion. Short, but everyone has already expressed their opinions. We hope there will be real actions following the words. Daniel Gross, Jeffrey Schott, Chu Qiang, thank you so much, gentlemen, and be safe wherever you are.